Good afternoon. Thank you for everyone who's joining us today. We've got a really exciting event. I can see everybody flowing in. We've just got a few introductions to begin with, and we'll be talking today about the Future Generations Act. So what makes green leaders uniquely qualified to address the problems that we face as a society? Those problems ranging from the climate and environmental crisis to the social justice crisis, to even the crisis of our democracy or the breakdown of our communities. Back in September, we got together to explore that question with our recently re-elected party leaders, Jonathan and Sian, and the answers kept revolving around the fact that Greens build policy, highlighting that everything is connected. The decisions need to reflect the way that everything is a green issue, because the solutions to our problems are interdependent. So to make better possible, we have to start thinking differently, acting collectively, and creating legislation that really supports that and allows it to start happening. Ultimately, that's how we make systems change to create a fairer society that we need and want. If that sounds impossible, well, we're here to tell you that it's not. Wales has been leading the way, and today we're going to explore the Welsh Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that received royal assent in 2015 and provides a model for the world to follow, not just here in the UK. So what is it and what does it do? I know that Jane's very keen to add some points to this with her expertise, but just very briefly, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act requires that public bodies in Wales to think about the long-term impact of their decisions, to work better with people, communities, and each other, and to prevent persistent problems such as poverty, health inequalities, and climate change. The Act is unique to Wales, and that means that it attracts interest from countries all around the world. And it offers a huge opportunity to make long-lasting, positive change to current and future generations. The Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, Sophie Howe, once described by The Guardian as the world's first minister of the unborn. Her role is to provide advice to the government and other public bodies in Wales to deliver social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being for current and future generations, and to report on how they're delivering the goals that are a globally responsible Wales, a prosperous Wales, a resilient Wales, a healthier Wales, a more equal Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language. So how does it work? And how do we measure the impact on the future? Is the Act creating systems change that it's set out to achieve? Why do we need a Future Generations Act? And what can England and beyond learn from Wales as the Future Generations Bill is brought to Parliament? So really that's a lot from me, but let's get to our incredible guests today. I'll just give a short introduction to everyone and say hello to each of them. So we've got the amazing John Bird, who is a crossbench peer, and many of you will know him as the founder and editor-in-chief of The Big Issue. Lord Bird tabled the Future Generations Bill as a private member's bill in the House of Lords. Thank you for joining us today, John.
Thank you.
We then have Caroline Lucas.
I'm very cross.
Very cross.
I'm very cross. That's why I'm a crossbencher.
I'm going to remember that joke, and but every time I meet a crossbencher, that's what I'll be straight in with.
How are you about the world?
We've got Caroline Lucas, our Green MP for a decade, who introduced the bill in Parliament with co-sponsors from all the main parties. And Jane Davidson. Jane is a former minister for the Welsh Government in Wales, and as she served for environment, sustainability and housing, and she proposed the Welsh law to protect future generations. She's recently written a book called Future Gen. So welcome to all of our panel. We're really delighted to have you here. just very quickly, I've got a bit of housekeeping that I need to do before we hear from our guests. And I just want to note to the audience that the Q&A will take up the latter half of the event. We're going to be together for an hour, running until 1:30, and up until that time, we'll have about 25 minutes for questions. As questions, if you've got a question, please put them in the Q&A function. So not the chat, there's a Q&A function that you can use. And there's also an upvoting system as part of that. So if you see a question that you really like, you can upvote it. And that means we'll be more likely to ask it. So do engage with us in those different ways, and we can use a little bit of democracy to sort out how we answer these questions. So thank you for all of your input. There will be some messages in the chat box on how to do this as well. So let's get started, and we'll begin with you, Jane. Could you give us a bit of background about what is the Future Generations Act in Wales, how it's progressed from the idea to legislation?
Thank you, Amelia, and thank you all so much for inviting me to contribute here today. I'm really excited, particularly with this audience, to look at how we can develop the agenda from Wales and then make it fit for purpose, not only in other parts of the UK, as John and Caroline are doing, but also potentially in other countries in the world. And it started in Wales, really, with the first Government of Wales Act, which was 1998. So it actually is a constitutional issue in Wales. And that first Government of Wales Act proposed that the incoming National Assembly for Wales that came in 1999 should have a duty to promote sustainable development in everything that it did. Now, as somebody who's been an educationalist most of my life and a policy wonk and an environmentalist by inclination, how exciting is that to go into a new institution which wants to promote sustainable development in everything that it did. But I have to say that in my 12 years as a minister, first in education and then, as you say, in environment, sustainability and housing, what I and the rest of us discovered is that duty was not enough. If you don't define what you're trying to achieve, and if you don't have a mechanism to achieve it, actually, even when we got massive political engagement by partnering with Plaid Cymru to propose that we actually put this right at the heart of government, we were not successful because there was not a law that protected how we delivered it. And it was a duty to promote, and promotion is not enough. And in fact, most of the time, as an ex-politician, politicians are accused of promoting and not delivering. So the critical thing for me in this was how we could turn that duty to promote into a duty to deliver. And that's why I proposed what is now the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So I just I'm going to share the screen now and hopefully show you the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in the context of this debate at the moment. And I do apologise, but I can't actually find it on my screen at the moment, which is a real problem for me. So perhaps I'll just go through the key provisions that we are looking at in the context of this today. As Amelia said in the beginning, the Act has 7 goals. And what is important about the 7 goals is they're not just goals separate from the legislation, they are there in the Act. And those 7 goals are all like a jigsaw of a values framework for what kind of world that we want to live in. So prosperity, for example, in the Act is described as innovative, productive and low carbon, recognising the limits of a global environment, acting on climate change, developing a skilled and well-educated population in an economy which generates wealth and provides employment opportunities, taking advantage of wealth generated through securing decent work. Now, I haven't yet found another country that actually defines its current and future prosperity in that way: innovative, productive, low carbon within the limits of the global environment. And effectively, this outlaws that is extractive behaviour that has actually been right at the core of our traditional economies. And of course, for a country like Wales, the first country in the world that signed £1 million cheque in a coal exchange and was right at the heart, a cradle of the Industrial Revolution, this is absolutely extraordinary. The other relevant goals are a resilient Wales, which is about not only maintaining but enhancing a biodiverse natural environment. Although I have to say, I do wish this was called a nature goal so that people really had an understanding of what is on their doorstep on a daily basis. I remember years ago asking somebody what they thought biodiversity meant, and I was asked, is it a band? And I thought we've got some way to go to get that phrase understood. But also a healthier Wales is where people's physical and mental well-being is maximised and choices and behaviours that benefit future health are understood. So this is not the traditional reactive response, but is actually an upstream response, trying to ensure that the actions which cause problems are addressed before they cause problems. And similarly, in terms of creating a more equal Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, which is about attractive, viable, self and well-connected communities, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, promoting culture, heritage and the Welsh language, and encouraging people to participate in arts, sports and recreation. And in many ways, I think the most important goal, which is a globally responsible Wales, which when Wales does anything it does through its public services, because all the public services are bound by this legislation, they take account of whether doing that thing may make a positive contribution to global well-being. And what is really important about this is it means that we know that lots of organisations, particularly big organisations such as fossil fuel companies, when they are telling us that they're going to do and improve what they're delivering to the world, they will then offshore their carbon emissions. That goal prevents Wales offshoring its carbon emissions. So in this context, we have the 7 goals interrelated. You can't get sustainable prosperity without also looking after nature, without contributing to people's well-being, which contributes towards their equality, which helps create cohesive communities and protects and defends culture and language. But really importantly, and what's turning out to be absolutely critical in the delivery of this, is you can think of the goals as the what is Wales trying to achieve. So that tackles the issue about promoting sustainable development without defining what you're trying to achieve. It also has 5 ways of working within it. You have to think long-term, preventatively, in an integrated way, joining those goals together. You have to collaborate with each other, and you have to involve people about whom decisions are being made. And this is critical because this isn't just a Wales programme in terms of how to take good decisions. These are the kind of core elements of good decisions that are outlined through the OECD, through the UN, for example. And interesting what has happened, and Emilia said this was unique, it has meant that Wales is now the only country in the world to be able to deliver legislatively on the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this is awful, really, absolutely awful that this is the position, but it is also a real opportunity, particularly in the context of small countries or countries within countries, to actually pick up this kind of legislation and take it forward because it aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals. So in creating this legislation, Wales became the first country in the world to not only deliver legislatively on the Sustainable Development Goals, but also the first country in the world to deliver legislatively on the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, development that meets the needs of current generations whilst not compromising on the needs of future generations. And I know that you mentioned that I have written a book. This is a book that I've written, and I was delighted that the UN endorsed it by saying what Wales is doing today, the world will do tomorrow. And I'm grateful that you are enabling us to take this forward. But what is absolutely critical in this context is the fact that if we really want to look after future generations, we have to ensure that those future generations are, in fact, enabled in the context of the decisions we take today. We cannot afford any longer to take decisions today that do not benefit future generations. Thank you very much.
I just have one more question for you, Jane, before we move on to Lord Bird. Just how is Wales measuring the impact of the Act? And 5 years on, what's changed?
Well, there's a whole roll of mechanisms that are set out in the Act. There is a requirement in terms of creating milestones so we can actually see the development of that. And we're looking for those milestones to be developed over the next year. There are 46 indicators against which people can also measure their performance. There are 2 external mechanisms in the sense of the Future Generations Commissioner, who has a really important role, as you outlined, in the context of both acting as a critical friend as people move on this journey. And of course, this journey is so countercultural against 200 years of previous economic prosperity defined in very different ways, and also the Wales Audit Office. And of course, there's also a mechanism in terms of people going to the courts. And there are a number of areas at the moment where, because it's legislation, it is enduring and people can use the courts in the context of taking the agenda forward. And just some brief examples, because I put a lot of examples in the book. There are 140 contributors to the book, including John and Caroline, in the context of what does this look like for the future and what kind of opportunities does it create. But if we think about the fact that Wales now has put anti-smacking into legislation, if we think about the fact that Wales is now outperforming most of the rest of the world on recycling, we were the first to introduce the carrier bag charge. We've changed the organ donation legislation. We've enabled 16 to 18-year-olds to vote in Welsh Parliament elections. We've seen that the proposal for an extended M4 that would have major ecological damage has been seen off. And interestingly, this is now a kind of key issue in the context of the 10-point plan announced yesterday, since the UK government and the Prime Minister has promised that they will put that M4 extension in place against the wishes of the people of Wales. So there are all sorts of ways. And probably the most exciting to leave people with is one of the major projects that I've outlined in the book, which is called Skyline, is where communities in the South Wales valleys, those very communities left behind post the Industrial Revolution, and so many government bodies have tried to help in the past. Skyline is a project where the communities can develop their own ideas according to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and develop a business plan where, if that is accepted, the land around them will be handed to them in perpetuity. And that's an entirely different approach from anything else I've seen. And having just come to this from a business seminar in Wales this morning and heard local authorities and businesses across Wales talk about using the Act, changing procurement, adding social value, I think we're seeing on a daily basis how this Act is starting to influence decisions in Wales. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jane. If you're part of our audience, you're part of 651 people who are listening today. Don't forget that you can ask questions in our Q&A box, which will be at the bottom of your screen. And if you just want to have a look and upvote questions, we're going to use the democratic way of being able to answer them, which is obviously great given the topic. And you will come to the questions that are most popular. I can see people from across the country who have been really inspired by this, and I'm going to come to Lord Bird and just say, other than being very cross at the state of the world, what inspired you to table the Future Generations Bill, and what are you hoping the impact will be for society?
Well, first of all, I applied to join the House of Lords. I wasn't chosen by any political party. I'm what's called a people's peer, And I chose to join the House of Lords because I was a very beautiful butterfly performing outside the box, and everybody telling me what a wonderful person I was because I did all these wonderful things with homeless people and with social investment. And I realized, of course, hang on, they're only saying that because I'm not in the box, because the box itself is not working very well. So I decided that what I would do was begin a process of trying to get into Parliament. I was very fortunate to be chosen as a crossbencher by a small group of peers, that's the way I got in. I went in with a very different perspective to virtually everybody else I have met in the House of Lords, with some exceptions, some wonderful green exceptions, I have to say. And that is to not simply help the poor to have a more comfortable time, which is what most people seem to be obsessed with. They're very, very obsessed with making the poor comfortable, but they're not asking the big questions, which is the future of the poor. What are we going to do about making sure that in the future we don't have the poor? There is very, very little work done on dismantling poverty. 80% of all the money that's spent, social money in the world, is spent on emergency and coping. I got involved with the bill because when 2016 happened and the referendum about Brexit, I found that the Welsh Assembly and the Welsh government there were looking at the idea of a model that the Big Issue developed, which is called PECC, which is PECC. And this is a very, very simple methodology, which is prevention, emergency, coping, cure. And the reason we developed that was people were coming to us and saying, we want to invest in a particular area. Where do we want to invest? So we'd say to them, do you want the money to go into prevention? Do you want the money to go into emergency, which is where most of the money goes? Do you want to go with people coping? So therefore you keep people comfortable because that's where you're parking them up and you don't believe they're ever going to go anywhere else, or you're going to spend it on cure. And if you actually looked at prevention and cure, unfortunately, they are the Cinderella parts of this methodology. Very simple methodology, and it's been adopted in places like Australia and all that. This made us cozy up to Wales. We thought, oh, this is interesting. And then we heard about the work of Jane Davidson and I forget her name, sorry, Howe, what's her first, Sophie Howe. And we heard about the commission after 2016, and we thought, this is really interesting. So what they're going to do is they're going to try and take the whole concept of prevention, and they're going to build it in to the structure of Welsh society, and not just Welsh society, but also the political and the local authorities and all the businesses and in the schools and all that. And what they're going to do is do exactly what I wanted them to do, and I want the world to do, which is not always being bit in the bum because you've done something 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, and it comes up to cut your throat at a later stage or stops you from achieving things. So I'd never experienced anything similar to that in the whole of my political life. I have to say, I started off as a very nasty underclass right winger, and I then tried Marxism, and then I tried a bit of Thatcherism for a while, when I was a small businessman in the 80s, even though I was a supporter of the miners. So, and then in the 90s, I became a social businessman, which was about getting people out of the grief, not on the basis of giving them handouts, but giving them hand-ups. And that's another one of the things that I'm really, really in love with. So what actually happened is I kind of segued my way towards this incredibly brilliant piece of legislation in one of the smallest countries in the world that had the profile of a mass movement of our thinking and our understanding of the world. I am a part of a generation that was written off after the Second World War. I was born just after the Second World War, and I was written off by the welfare state. And this is one of my big problems with what happens sometimes with the laws of unintended consequences when governments don't think through. If you imagine that you have the whole of the population of 11-year-olds, and you say to those 11-year-olds, now what we're going to do is we're going to give you a test. And if you fail this test, then you can go into a secondary modern school, which largely is an underfunded, underapplied, underutilized form of education just for everybody. And that'll educate you largely for an unskilled or a semi-skilled job. It won't take you anywhere else. It won't take you out of poverty. It won't get you into high earners. And what we're going to do is this legislation is that which is actually put in place by the Labour government of 48, but it actually comes from the Butler Education Act of 1944, even though he didn't want to run it the way that it was applied. And then what we're going to do, the people who passed their 11 plus, as that's what it was called, we're going to cream them off and we're going to put them in our grammar schools. And we're going to make them the managers of the new economy or whatever. Imagine today if I said to you, what we're going to do is we're going to have 100 children and we're going to test them at the age of 11. And then at the end of that period, 89% of them are going to fail. You would go nuts. You can't do that to our children. But that's what they did. And unfortunately, what that has led to is a generation who failed at education, another generation who failed at education, and another generation who failed at education. And all of those generations have been largely the population of our A&E departments, because they, through eating poor food, because they're low wage, they're part of the lower wage economy, or they're in social security. So if you actually look at it, there's a class base to poverty in the UK. And if you go to our prisons, I'm an ex-offender, I go into a prison, I talk to everybody, I ask them one question: how did you do at school? And virtually all of them will say, failed. So you've got these laws of unintended consequences. I do not think Nye Bevan and Attlee and Cripps, I do not think they intended to do this, to create a vast underclass of people who are still with us, and who actually, it's the children of the children of the children. And then my family. My family's like this. I'm the only posh one. I'm the posh geezer, and my children are posh, but all my other brothers and their children, they're all stuck in the mire. They've got no education, they have no prospects for the future, but they did not intend to do this in 48. Those are the laws of unintended consequences. And this act, in my opinion, this bill and what's happening in Wales, in my opinion, is the only grown-up piece of thinking I've seen in virtually the whole of my life. I've never seen anybody do that. I tried to move to Wales last year, but my children wouldn't go with me. And I would have had to live by myself. And, you know, that would have been murder, because I'd have been drinking every night. But the point is, what is interesting is that you have this opportunity of spreading it through the work of Jane, through the work of Caroline. You have the way of spreading it into England and hopefully to the other devolved countries. I'm probably over talking now, but the point is, I came at this from the simple thing: let's get real about prevention. And this is it. I also want to commend Amelia for saying that thing, green is everything, because I always say green is this, that, and the other, but actually it's everything. It's like the center of the web. Everything, art, culture, everything is school, disability, human rights. It's all green, and I'm very pleased. I shall be using that one all the time. I will end on the fact that if the work of Jane and if the work of Caroline can in some ways be spread throughout this country, then I will certainly think that we have achieved a revolution in thinking. If we can pass everything through the prism of future generations and their well-being, we will have achieved something that no political system has ever achieved. And this silo-based political system that we have today robs Peter to pay Paul, causes problems here and causes problems there. And I think the sustainable goals are the only way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Really powerful stuff. And you know, I think all of this does take a different way of thinking, and I was really interested in those last points that you made. And do you think that the process of debating this bill will have an impact on how your colleagues think, how other legislation gets shaped, or even make them think differently about how they use their influence? Or do you think that's just wishful thinking?
Well, that's very interesting. I had a lovely chat this morning with my staff in our parliamentary office, and I said, look, we've got to be in every bill. If it's about tobacco, there's a bill going down about tobacco. I should be saying, what about the future generations? If there's a bill about foreign policy or defense or, you know, roads or whatever, I should be there, or Caroline should be there. And I'm sure that Caroline will be doing that and being an absolute pain in the rear, because she will be bringing it. Because there is, as you say, about green, there is no way, there is no bill or anything passing through the House of Commons and the House of Lords at this moment that is not related to future generations. And if we can get that, if we, the one thing we've got to do, and I think this is my problem, I think we've got to learn to talk to people in the streets and in the housing estates on the third floor, where they don't understand environmentalism, they don't understand the green issue. So we need a lot of people who can talk in that kind of way. And when we get through to those, and we have on occasions, I think then they become the greatest arbiters and the greatest representatives. So we've got to change the way we talk. And anyway, but over to Caroline, sorry.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John. I can see so many of you feeling really energized and inspired by this. So many questions coming in. Don't forget to upvote them. More people joining us. I feel like this has been a really energizing conversation about how we can shape the future. So we've had two incredible speakers. Now on to Caroline. So Caroline, it sounds like the Future Generations Bill could be a real game changer in terms of how civil society functions. How are you hoping a potential Future Generations Act in England could change the way government and civil society works?
Thanks very much, Amelia, and thanks for this opportunity. And it's a real honour to be here with Jane and John, so thank you. In terms of answering your question, then it seems that in a way, you know, it's difficult to think of a single piece of legislation or policy that wouldn't have been better if we'd had a Future Generations Act. You know, whether we're talking about the environment or public health or social justice, I think short-termism is a real plague in our politics. It infects the substance of decisions, and I think it infects the culture of Westminster too. And I think that's especially the case when it comes to the Treasury, quite frankly. So a Future Generations Act, I think, would help enormously, both in terms of decision-making processes and the requirements on ministers and civil servants, but also in terms of mindsets and culture, that revolution of thinking that John spoke about. And of course, it's not a silver bullet. Wales isn't a utopia. It's very lovely, but it's not a utopia, and there's lots of things that we need other policies for. But I think we can imagine what difference the Act could make by looking at some current hot topics, for example, and most immediately, the terrible pandemic that we're living through right now. Interestingly, I introduced the Commons version of this bill back in March, and it was on the day before Parliament was suspended. So it was on the very eve of that first COVID lockdown. And when I was about to sort of go into Parliament to speak to this bill, part of me was thinking, are people going to think this is a bit strange? Everyone else is worrying about COVID and I'm talking about a Future Generations bill. But actually, of course, it was exactly the right time to be talking about it in a way, because it is entirely appropriate in that moment to be thinking, what could we have done differently to prevent this pandemic from happening? How can we stop something like this from ever happening again? And that idea of acting today for tomorrow, what should we have done before to mean that we weren't facing this pandemic now, and what can we do now to make sure we're not facing another pandemic in a few years' time? Acting today for tomorrow seems as relevant now as it ever has. We've had more time, of course, now to learn the grim lessons from COVID about what happens when you ignore scientific warnings, what happens when you basically ignore the dangers of delay, the benefits of prevention, and the interconnections between nature and human health. And looking at the bill, I think clause 6 of the bill is particularly relevant because it goes into the detail of the future generations principle on forecasting and reporting on emerging risks and acting and deploying resources in a preventative manner. And it feels that this is even more important as the UK leaves the EU, because we know, sadly, that one of the many losses of leaving the EU is that the status of the precautionary principle is now very much more in question. Preventing problems from happening in the first place is a no-brainer compared to end-of-pipe solutions after they've already happened, whether you're talking about public health or the environment. And that's the case both in terms of the damage that's done, but also from a very simple cost perspective as well. You know, it's been estimated that the cost of COVID-19 has already been between $8 and $16 trillion globally as of July. It's estimated that costs in the US alone may reach as high as 16 trillion by the fourth quarter of 2021. Experts estimate the cost of reducing risks to prevent pandemics to be 100 times less than the cost of responding to such pandemics, which provides, in their words, strong economic incentives for transformative change. You know, in a way, I'm sorry to put this into economic arguments, you know, there ought to be very good moral arguments for stopping pandemics, for goodness sake. But given that I was saying that I would hope that this bill might have some of its strongest effect in the Treasury, then some of the economics of this might just concentrate their minds. There was a really interesting study from Scotland on this same theme, which provided another illustration of the importance of this kind of idea of preventative spending, because they found that as much as 40% of all public spending was devoted annually to tackling what they called failure demand. In other words, demand that could have been avoided had earlier preventative measures been put in place. There was another study by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation that found that poverty costs Britain £78 billion a year, with £1 in every 5 of government spending being used to make up for the way which poverty damages people's lives. And just to finish, I guess, obviously the climate emergency is the other major area where the human and economic benefits of preventative action are staggering and yet still don't have the traction that one would expect. You know, it was as much as 14 years ago when we had the Stern Review on climate change, and it said that the cost of action on climate change was just 1% of GDP annually, while if we ignore climate change, then the economic damage of that is of the order of 20% of GDP. I mean, frankly, I don't think GDP really comes into it. If you've got a trashed planet, then it doesn't really matter what it costs. But the point is, we can certainly afford to take that preventative action. On the green recovery, the PM has talked about intergenerational justice, but the Treasury's economic response to COVID has all too often doubled down on business as usual. I think young people are at the forefront of the campaigns for a transformative Green New Deal, and yet, as we saw with the PM's 10-point plan yesterday, they're being offered a bargain basement imitation with none of the boldness or ambition that we need to see. And finally, I think meanwhile, as an expert report on nature and pandemics recently noted, the same human activities that drive climate change and biodiversity loss also drive pandemic risk through their impacts on the environment. So that to me is the prize. If we can design the Future Generations Act in England to the best of our ability, then a radical departure from current Treasury decision-making could be the jewel in the crown that would result.
Thanks so much, Caroline. I did have another question, but I think you might have answered it in your last response, just trying to link some of those COVID points and reflecting on the varying responses of the nations, just what could England learn from Wales. But if you've got something else to add, that would be great. If you don't, then I'll move on to questions from the Q&A.
Well, I'll be really quick because I'm sure that, you know, getting to the Q&A is more important. But I did just think about 3 particular areas that we might want to explore if there's time. One is about the process of how we set the well-being goals. At the moment, the bill puts forward 7 proposed goals, and it requires the government to conduct a public consultation. And I would love to see whether there might be a role, for example, for citizens' assemblies as part of that process, and whether or not that would actually open it up. And crucially, whether or not it might make people feel that this is their legislation, their well-being goals, their priorities. In other words, it might be a way of getting more buy-in. I think a second possible lesson might be whether the bill needs to be more explicit about the environment. So, for example, it currently references the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but maybe it should also be referring to the equivalent global body for biodiversity, this Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform, sorry, it's a mouthful, on biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's called IBBES for short, but essentially it's the IPCC for nature. And I wonder whether that should be there more firmly. And then maybe the last thing to say might be a third potential area where we might learn more from the Wales experience, is whether there should be a more explicit link between local and global action. You know, so much of our overall impact is because of our consumption patterns, our production patterns and so forth. So much of what we do through the agriculture that we import and so forth, the food that we import, the clothes that we import, has such huge impacts on other countries. I wonder if there's a way of looking a little bit more about some of those international implications of the bill as well. But I'll leave it there because time is short and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Just such an incredible panel, and I can see how everyone is engaging with this. We've got so many questions, and what I'll do is take 3 initially, if that's all right, and I'll then go to Jane, John, then Caroline. So the first 3 questions, which thank you for everyone who upvoted, 62 people agreed with the first one. How does one prevent big business from driving government and political agendas, as so often has occurred, while still allowing business to thrive, but not at a cost of the public, as we've seen with tobacco, oil, nuclear and pesticides? So that was basically the links of big business and government. The second, with 54 people upvoting it, is universal basic income part of the proposals? And thirdly, with 47 people agreeing with it, how do you persuade politicians, economists, business leaders and the media to give up their addiction to GDP growth and endless boosting of consumer consumption? I'll come to you first, Jane.
Thank you. And I mean, I've been reading the chat and the questions. There is a phenomenal conversation going on here that I hope that somebody's going to capture at the end and let us have afterwards, because it's just like being in this incredibly buzzy room with people with all sorts of ideas. I mean, I have to say, in the context of Wales, and maybe this is something that's helped Wales do this, Wales is a country of SMEs. I.e. small and medium-sized businesses, and most of them are small. And I think that actually, if 99% of our businesses in Wales are SMEs, and it's only about 93% of those that get above small. Sorry, 93% of those are small. So there's only a small number of businesses in Wales that are either in the kind of like middle-sized or large size. And that, I think, is very helpful, because the fastest growing sector in Wales at the moment of businesses are those businesses with purpose. You know, it's almost like a fourth sector growing in the context of social enterprises, community interest companies, etc. So there is a real social and environmental commitment in Wales that's captured in that, and the opportunity. Yeah, in the context of UBI, the Future Generations Commissioner has been floating UBI for a long time, and Wales has been particularly good in terms of responding to the Real Living Wage Foundation, for example, as well. And I'm a strong supporter of UBI, and I think what the Wellbeing of Future Generations framework allows is any of these initiatives. That's the point. It's not prescriptive. It's not saying we know best. It's giving the framework by any of these initiatives that are good for the climate, good for communities, good for people young and old, can contribute towards equality, health, etc., can be taken forward. So I think we'll see UBI in at least one party, perhaps 2 parties, manifestos for the next Welsh election. And thirdly, this is very much a move away from GDP. I mean, obviously, GDP will continue to be measured as long as the UK government measures GDP, but this is very much away from a move away from GDP and actually measuring in much more well-being economic terms.
Brilliant, thank you, Jane. I just want to add that the universal basic income has been Green Party policy for decades, so I hope it will be more than one political party, because it's always in ours. So I'll come to you, Lord Bird, for your response.
Hello? Yeah, you've frozen.
We can hear you.
Yes.
Oh,
So
yeah, you can hear me. Oh, yes, all right. The best way to control business, big business, pushing around the government, sometimes the government and big business are the same thing, so let's not kid ourselves. However often they might even tread on each other's toes in the process. That doesn't mean to say that there isn't a consanguinity between them, which is a very posh word. The interesting thing for me is that if you actually look at the growth of, for instance, Amazon is not driven by some greedy people from Wall Street. It's not driven by greedy shareholders. It's driven by the public. The public buy into Amazon because Amazon gives them something they want. And that is actually, in reverse, a sign of the power of the public. And it's the public doing something that we should all abhor, and we do, because it's ripping the guts out of our high streets, and it's ripping the guts out of our small suppliers. But let's bear in mind that that is the power, a greater use of the power than any power that you have with the vote. The vote is a very powerful way of changing things. Now, what we've got to do is actually look at the way that people give the public what they want, and then we've got to turn it and environmentalize it, socialize it, greenify it. We have to be really, really clever. But the power of big business is based on the client, on the customer, on the person who buys the stuff. And that's the science that we need to do. We need to outmaneuver these, I was going to say bastards, but it's probably not suitable on this lovely platform. So anyway, so I would say let's just realize it's all about economic power. Let's turn that economic power to the advantage of the world and not to its disadvantage that's being used now. With regard to universal basic income, I have never been a fan of it. I have never bought into it. I have never actually spent even a lot of time thinking about it. But when I hear that a Finnish gentleman with a long hair and a long beard gets £1,000 a month or the equivalent to write poems and to do his art and produce his own little books, I think, God, maybe there is something in this universal basic income. Maybe there is something that needs to be done. So I'm going to be incredibly diplomatic. I have a problem of taking from people their own need to rise through their own efforts, because I'm not a great believer in somebody doing your exams for you. I'm a great believer that the strength of any individual is always the strength of how they can use their own energies and their own skills and abilities to move forward. What I don't like is then that somebody move forward at the expense of another because they've had all the posh education and all of the stuff that goes with the kind of Borisization of opportunity. So I'm not a great, but if there's a way of not taking the sense that we all need initiative in this world that we're going into, with a world that we don't even know what the new jobs are. We're all going to have to be boxed up. Well, I won't be, but you lot will be. You're all going to have to be ducking and diving and bobbing and weaving, and you're going to have 25 jobs before you get to 50 or whatever. So where does universal basic income fit into that? I'd love to see a discussion around that one. With regard to GDP, we always find weird ways of measuring happiness and fulfillment. We always find weird ways of doing that. And that is why the sooner we get rid of this GDP and we start looking at the quality of life, as soon as we do that, then we are moving towards a situation where we can start feeling good about the fact that we are not looking for growth in more and more Primarks or more Amazons or more things. Isn't it interesting that when a lot of local authorities get very excited when Costas or Primark, well, not Primark, or you know, one of these shops, you know, Starbucks, they come to their high street in areas where they normally wouldn't be, and people say, "Oh, it's going to be prosperous." Then you move in with all of the restaurants and cafes, and you think this is prosperous, and it looks kind of a bit like the West End of London or Knightsbridge or something up there in Rotherham or somewhere. But actually, it's not, because everybody working there is a part of the working poor, because you could not live on the wages of those. And we have to create a high wage economy. We have to find a way of getting people out of poverty by increasing their skills and abilities so that they can sell them in the labour market at a higher price. Now, I am interested in that, and I don't think GDP comes into that. What comes into that is the most interesting thing, is how happy you are in the world. And I would like to move, as Wales is doing, towards the idea of abandoning anything to do with GDP. You can tell I'm not right on. You can tell I always say the wrong things, but forgive me, my trespasses. All my green friends will tell me what to say next time I see them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John and Caroline.
Just looking at the chat, John, I think you've got a lot of love on this platform, so no worries there. John talked about consanguinity, which is a very nice word, which I shall use more often. But I mean, I think when you see what's happening with the relationship between big business and this government in particular, it's just so shocking, that complicity, particularly around the sales and buying of PPE, for example. So I think John's points were spot on. But about big business, what I would say in a sense is that although, of course, consumer behavior can make a big difference and we can all do things differently, I think it's very dangerous to assume that there's just an individual systems, individual change rather than a systems change that's needed to this. And in terms of the systems change, what I would say about big business is that they have power because we've given them power. The World Trade Organization, the regulations that we don't put in place, politicians around the world have chosen to allow big business to have massive free reign. And they've done that, not least because of the consanguinity we've just been talking about. So if we want to reduce the power of big business, one of the first things we can start to do is to regulate them. Well, then people say, well, if you start regulating business in the UK, they'll all go off and move to the US or to Germany or whatever. And that's where one of the longest standing Green Party policies comes into place, which we never talk about very much. But we have a policy that says that businesses should site here to sell here, i.e. if you want to sell your widgets in the UK, then you site your factory in the UK, because that way we can regulate it and we can decide what your environmental emissions should be or how much you pay your staff or whatever. So there are ways. I guess I would say that the power of business is because of the lassitude of our politicians, the fact that they haven't put in place the regulatory framework that we need to see. It's also, of course, to do with our out of control advertising industry and the pressure on consumerism. There's that lovely way that Professor Tim Jackson puts it, sort of saying that the advertising industry persuades us to spend money we don't have on things that we don't need, to make impressions that don't last on people we don't care about. And I think that just about sums it up. So we should be regulating the advertising industry as well. On UBI, to me, I'm surprised John doesn't support it. We ought to have a different conversation about that another time, because for me, UBI is absolutely about putting that safety net in, that security at the most basic level to ensure that everyone has the basics of what they need. And to me, I'm delighted to think of the man with long hair writing his poems. They may well be a massive contribution to society. I think what UBI does actually is just completely transforms what we value in society and how we think about what we're here for. And you know, I think John said something about he doesn't like the idea of people not rising through their own effort, but our own effort can be looking after our aged parents or our kids or the person down the road or the allotment, or there's many ways of measuring that. And I think UBI would just allow a huge flourishing of human imagination and ingenuity, and would be a net net good thing. And finally, on GDP growth, I mean, I think the beauty of this bill is that it goes right, or the Act in Wales, is that it goes right to the heart of the purpose of life, really, and is the purpose of life about our well-being and the well-being of others around us and the nature that we share this precious planet with, or is it about measuring GDP growth? And when you put it like that, it's just so ridiculous to think that GDP is actually telling us anything very useful about what's happening in our society at all. So I think that the bill is a really good way of getting into those conversations, so that we recognize that on a planet of finite resources, you simply cannot grow infinitely. That's just madness. And that if we're really thinking about future generations, and if we're thinking about finite resources, then it's obvious that we need to be redistributing those resources and not overusing them, so that we can allow those other generations to flourish. And there are some wonderful initiatives out there, like the Alliance of Wellbeing Economies. There are groups already who are looking at, which Wales is part of. Good old Wales, we should all go and move to Wales, except that's not very sustainable. But you know, there are so many good initiatives already in this space. It's quite exciting.
Fantastic. We're really coming close to time, but we've got so many questions. I don't know if you've got time for just one more very quickly. I appreciate you're all very busy. There are two questions that I thought were interesting at the top of this list. If you'd just like to answer one of them, that would be fantastic. One of them is about a specific example in Powys, which I'm also aware of. But the question fundamentally is, how can we effectively hold the government to account on it when the Act isn't being listened to, and make sure that it's not just aspirational? And the other is, how do you think that the Future Generations Act could be translated to the local authority level? I'll start with you, John, and then Caroline, and then Jane.
Well, how can it be translated to the local authorities? I think what Sophie Howe has said to me on occasions, and Jane as well, is when you actually enshrine this in an act, then you have to begin a process of education. You have to start educating people who've been doing things a particular way for 10, 20, 30 years. And you have to say that actually this is an extension of democracy. It's extending democracy into the future. It is something that you desperately need, that it should be at every level of the local area. It should be in schools. It should be in the local authorities. It should be in the police station. It should be in the office of the Social Security office. It should be in the hospitals. And that it will only be achieved by a thorough, careful introduction, and a very thorough, using the right educational tools, so you're not knocking people around, you're not getting them just to tick their boxes. And in my opinion, that's one of the big problems we have. Universal credit, for instance, which sounds like a brilliant idea, because you have a mentor, and you don't have to fill in all these forms and all this sort of stuff, but you do. It was never, ever, no one ever knew whether it was going to work or not, because they didn't train the staff up. So if you're going to institute something, you have to train people up who implement it, and they know what they're talking about. And I think that that's the only way that this will work in the local area.
Thank you. Caroline.
John's dealt with the local area really well, so I was going to answer the other question, although I don't know anything about the Powys example. And I'd be really interested to see if Jane agrees that I've understood what I'm about to say properly. But essentially, as I understand it, that with the Welsh Act, the strongest remedial process that the Commissioner for Future Generations can employ is a so-called Section 20 review. In other words, they can look into the extent to which a public body is safeguarding the future generation, the ability of future generations to meet their needs. But it doesn't actually, it can't force any action. Its role is influencing the context and behavior. What we've explored with the version that John and I have put forward is that the new bill would provide an express legal right exercisable by a person to bring proceedings against a public body on the grounds that it has either already acted or it proposes to act in a way which breaches those obligations breaches the future generations. So I don't know whether this answers the question, and Jane, I'm sure will tell me if it does, because I don't know what the Powys example is. But when we were looking at the version of the bill that we're bringing forward, one of the things we were trying to do was to see if it was possible, and I guess time will tell if it is, to bring something which had some slightly sharper teeth when it came to enforcement. And there's a big debate about this, I know, and it's not simple as simple to say enforcement is always better, but we wanted something stronger, and that's what we've tried to draft. And maybe, not knowing the Powys case, that might be helpful in that situation. But it feels to me like it's worth exploring, at least if we could go one step further than the Welsh Act and see if we could build some sharper teeth into it. Brilliant, thank you, Caroline. Jane?
Yeah, well, if I just pick up on that point first and come back to the local authority one, one of the key ways in which I talk to other countries about the Act, there've been some, comments on, for example, why don't we talk about New Zealand? And I've been in New Zealand about 10 times in the last month. That's the great virtue of Zoom. And there's a lot of countries around the world are really interested in this. And like all politics, they perhaps want to take bits of it. Now, New Zealand is in a most extraordinary example to all of us in terms of how particularly Jacinda Ardern has demonstrated that you can have a really strong agenda around well-being and promote it. And in a system which was not meant to return a single party has managed to do that. One of the things that colleagues in New Zealand are talking to me about is actually the enshrining into legislation. Because in New Zealand, they have wellbeing budgeting, but it's not enshrined in legislation. And so it's what the enshrining in legislation does in the context of creating a new environment. Because if Jacinda Ardern, for some reason, wasn't there tomorrow, there is nothing that would protect her legacy. And I was very clear in the context of my 3 outings as a minister in Wales, 3 administrations, is that if you don't have a law, you don't have something enduring. And I think the second point is that when I talk about this being lessons from a small country, the reason I've got 140 people contributing, including John and Caroline, is because we're not suggesting that people should adopt what Wales has done wholesale, because what Wales has done has been created by Wales for Wales, and other countries will have different needs. And whereas in Wales, although it's still to be tested, actually naming and shaming in a small country is hugely effective, but it may not be effective in a larger environment. And therefore, I would expect every other country that looks at the legislation will perhaps come up with some similar ideas around goals and ways of working, but the implementation and the ways in which people are engaged. And I love the Citizen Assembly proposals in the proposed legislation for England, UK. So we're all on a learning curve. And if things work particularly well in somewhere else, if I was still a minister, I'd want to come back and look at how we amended Welsh legislation to accommodate that. But Amelia, your point about UBI having been in green manifestos for how long did you say?
Ever.
Well, all right. Okay, let's take ever. Ever since the National Assembly was created in 1999, that duty to promote was there, but it's only been turned into law in 2015, commenced in 2016, 2 years of looking at what the plans look like. Effectively, it's only been in operation for 2 years. And if we, through whether or not John and Caroline are successful now, hopefully by the numbers of people on this call and everywhere else, which is why I've offered myself up and saying I'll do webinars anywhere to get these ideas out there, we will see other countries do this. I mean, I'm in conversation with 14 countries at the moment. As an ex-politician, from people contacting me to sort of say, well, how does it work? Oh, I'd really like that in my own backyard. But of course, we've also got to accept that, Caroline rightly said, Wales is not a utopia. We would like to become a utopia, but we're certainly not there yet. And for the people on the call who said chicken farms in Powys, they are probably one of the best examples of why we're not a utopia. But this changing legislation takes time. And as a result of the Act, there will have to be other legislation. Chicken farms in Powys are directly the responsibility of the local authority. And I know that lots of people are thinking about, can they use the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act to take Powys County Council to court over this? But I can give you a bit of hope, which is that there will be an agriculture bill pretty shortly. And that agriculture bill will redefine agricultural support in the context of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And that is really important, because for all of those of you who follow the Committee on Climate Change work, you will know that Wales is already the poorest part of the UK in terms of complying in the context of agricultural standards. We are worse in creating runoff. We are worse in the use of chemicals. And this will all be addressed in the contribution of an agriculture bill. So the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is a start. We have a strong environment legislation, and now what we need to see is every other aspect brought into line. And if that could be done in a decade, I think Wales would be a utopia.
Incredible. Thank you so much to the panel. Looking at all the comments in the chat, if we'd had a physical audience, there would have been a standing ovation right now. You've clearly provided food for thought, information and inspiration that is just really inspiring to such a large group of people. Thanks to you, our audience, for joining us. We had over 650 people joining us and getting involved in this conversation. We had over 100 questions. So sorry that we weren't able to answer them all, but I just think it proves the need for this conversation to continue. I hope that you can take that conversation to your communities, to your social media, and make sure that more people hear about the power of thinking about future generations and how it can change how we work and operate. So thank you so much to everybody involved, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.